In 2001, you were in Afghanistan, and just before the war there started, and it was global news everywhere. You got captured by the Taliban, and I'd love to know more about that. But before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit, leading up to that, what areas of journalism were you involved in, and what other assignments had you kind of carried out before you got into Afghanistan?
I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express, and prior to that, I'd been a royal correspondent, and that's
Okay.
somebody who covers the affairs of the royal family. And goodness me, that was really quite treacherous. I didn't enjoy it very much. It was like covering The Sopranos. Um, it was quite tough. And prior to that, I was an investigative journalist. So
Wow.
I ended up in being sent to not Afghanistan, being sent to Pakistan
Were you?
after
When
the
was
event
this?
of 9/11.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that makes sense, because I was wondering how then did you get involved in the Afghanistan scene, and were you at that time were you involved in like geopolitics and international relations and things?
I've always been fascinated with the Middle East and Asia, the MENA region. And after the events of 9/11, a few of us were convinced, that this has to involve the Middle East. Um, what we didn't realize was that it was actually at that point anyway, it was the actions of Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda network.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of your listeners and viewers will be too young to remember what happened in 2001 and 9/11. And,
Yeah.
they'll have seen the images, no doubt, of the Twin Towers being hit and imploding and
Yeah.
falling. And it was such a shocking day that this is what we saw on TV every 15 minutes of every hour, lest we would forget, as if. But it was, our screens were bombarded
You you're right,
with
and
it
I
for
think
the next
I think
few
for all of us
weeks.
who were old enough to remember things from that time, I think everyone remembers exactly what they were doing, where they were at the time. It's
It was one of
yeah,
those moments, yes. And it was like the assassination of
yeah,
JFK, except I think this was bigger. And it's one of the favorite questions asked in a newsroom when people are evaluating news is if the assassination of JFK happened on the day of 9/11 and man landed on the moon, what would you lead with?
wow,
you
interesting
know,
question.
it's it was the
Yeah,
biggest story, and will come to define the
yes,
millennium and the start of the
yeah,
new century. It
it
was
was.
huge.
So
So, as chief reporter, I was sent to Pakistan, a country I'd never been
yeah,
to. I had no sort of cultural insight into Pakistan, and I didn't want to go. I had gone to Heathrow Airport, which was in total chaos.
were you alone going
Uh,
into Pakistan, or was it a team?
well, in those days, you could fly into Pakistan and get your
Yeah,
visa
at the airport.
at
Yeah,
the airport. Mhm. Now you have to do some ridiculous maths test and prove that you have money in the bank before you can go to Pakistan. It's I did complain, and the embassy at the time told me, well, this is what we have to go through to enter Britain. So surely, you know, we're not asking you to do anything that we're not doing ourselves. And I thought, oh, well, fair enough. And
so what was your brief going into Pakistan, and what were you thinking? Did you have in mind which city you're going to go into and who you're going to be meeting? What was the mindset at the time?
Well, I left for Heathrow Airport certain that I was going to get on a flight to New York. But the impact of 9/11 was to shut down America's airspace in its entirety for nearly a week. It was seismic, you know, the psychological damage that this did to the American people is still there today. They'd never been invaded before, apart from when the British burnt down the White House. But, you know, this felt very much like a war on America, and Americans were in a state of absolute shock that although their country had gone to war with more than 30 other different nations in the last 50 years, that a war was actually coming onto their doorstep.
It was unimaginable.
So psychologically, it had the same impact as October the 7th had on the Israeli people. They were shell-shocked, and it felt personal to each and every citizen. So, you know, this America was a nation that was in a state of shock. So they had to lash out. Somebody has to pay. And for some bizarre reason, although within a couple of days, people knew that the 19 hijackers were all Arabs, the majority coming from Saudi Arabia, people were mystified as to why George Bush suddenly swung to Afghanistan and said, I want Osama bin Laden. He was the alleged mastermind behind 9/11. And so all this focus of attention swung from New York to Afghanistan. And just to remind people, you know, there wasn't any Taliban on those planes. George Bush said he was going to bomb the country back to the 8th century. It might not have been George Bush, but one of his neocons said that they would bomb Afghanistan unless Osama bin Laden was handed over. And of course, if you understand the relationship in that region between an ordinary Afghan and his guest, you can't just demand that somebody hands over, you know, an individual. And, you know, fast forwarding to the 21st century, when Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated by Israel in Iran, he was in a guest house. You know, he was one of their guests. And of course, Iran will strike back, unfortunately.
So it's history repeating itself.
Quite how, we don't know. But in that region, if you're a guest of somebody, you are very precious.
Some people still don't understand the strong tribal code of Afghanistan. But also at the time, I remember, because I grew up in Pakistan. I was born in England, but I lived in Pakistan for a number of years, and I've always been interested in Afghanistan. I did my master's in Middle East politics, and my dissertation was on the Taliban, actually. Um, and I remember at the time the Taliban was saying two things. One is that we did not invite Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. We inherited him. When we took over, he was already there. Secondly, if you want us to hand him over, give us some proof. And no one's willing to give them any proof, and just threats and ultimatums. And so it didn't go anywhere.
I think that the Taliban in the end did more than that. I think that and it was never reported in the mainstream media, but I think that through Mullah Omar, who was the then spiritual leader of the Taliban, I think that they said, we will hand him over to a third country that we both agree with, and just show us some of the evidence first, and then, we will hand him over, which isn't an unreasonable request. And if you think about it, if somebody demanded somebody from the West, we would be saying, well, give us the evidence first. It's a terrible crime. Give us the evidence, and then we'll hand him over.
But the mindset was different. It was, what's happening in America is unthinkable, and how dare you ask us for evidence?
Well, somebody had to pay. And, unfortunately, this is the American mantra. If something bad happens to America, somebody has to pay.
Yeah, it's also unfortunate, even today, to this day, Western diplomacy there's not much threats, like what's happened with Ukraine and Russia, how that all started, and it was just threats. And then we went from there to threatening China, sanctions. All diplomacy just revolves around threats and ultimatums. And it's really unfortunate.
Yes, well, it's a lack of understanding, a lack of cultural awareness, and it's something that it was a lesson that I learned very quickly when I was arrested in Afghanistan. And looking back now, I see my presence there. It was a clash of two cultures. They couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand them. They liked me about as much as I liked them. And it was quite a fraught 11 days. But never once did they harm me. They didn't try any great psychological tricks. They didn't use torture. In fact, as I've said, at that time, the war was starting with America. And of course, America just swept into Afghanistan and seized so many people, and then transported them off to Guantanamo Bay. And I often say to people, thank God I was captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world, and not by the Americans.
Wow.